Lance Stroll's position at Aston Martin has quietly become one of the most fragile situations on the entire Formula One grid, and new evidence emerging ahead of the 2026 season has only intensified that reality. What was once dismissed as routine criticism has now evolved into a serious question about whether he can survive in a team that is preparing for the most ambitious and demanding chapter in its history. The warning signs were already visible throughout the 2025 season, but recent comments from Nelson Piquet Jr. have crystallized the issue in a way that is difficult to ignore. Without making clear-throat personal attacks, he identified a structural problem that goes beyond lap times or isolated results. Verdict suggested that Stroll's biggest weakness is not raw talent, but the absence of genuine pressure, something that becomes increasingly dangerous in an environment that is about to demand absolute excellence. On paper, Stroll's 2025 campaign did not begin disastrously, opened the season with points in Australia, and briefly appeared competitive relative to Fernando Alonso. However, that early promise faded quickly, and what followed was a familiar pattern that has repeated itself across multiple seasons. Consistency vanished, confidence dipped, and results became sporadic to the point where his presence barely influenced Aston Martin's overall performance. As the season unfolded, the contrast with Alonso became increasingly uncomfortable. While Alonso continued to extract results from an increasingly difficult car, Stroll slipped into the midfield shadows. By the end of the year, he had finished far down the standings, separated from his teammate by multiple drivers and a significant points gap. That kind of disparity is no longer sustainable for a team with championship ambitions. What makes this situation far more serious than in previous years is the timing. Aston Martin are no longer positioning themselves as a long-term project with vague goals. Everything about their recent moves points towards 2026 as a defining moment. The arrival of Adrian Newey, the works partnership with Honda, and massive investment in infrastructure all signal a team that expects results, not patience. In that context, Stroll's low-impact performances take on a very different meaning. He's no longer simply underperforming in a midfield outfit. He's potentially holding back a team that believes it has the tools to fight at the front. In Formula One,
thank you all for coming today.
perception
We are
matters
incredibly
almost
excited
as
about the
much
upcoming
as
season and
results.
the opportunities it
And the
presents for
perception
innovation and
forming
competition.
around Stroll is becoming increasingly difficult to defend. The issue highlighted by Piquet Jr. touches the core of this problem. Pressure shapes elite drivers. It sharpens decision making, heightens focus, and forces adaptation. Drivers who know their seat is under threat tend to extract every last tenth. Stroll, by contrast, often appears insulated from consequence, and that insulation may now be working against him. This lack of visible urgency has followed Stroll throughout his career. Early on, as a young driver trying to prove himself, there were flashes of hunger and aggression. Podium finishes and stand-out wet-weather performances suggested real potential. But as the seasons progressed and his position became secure, that edge dulled. The spark that once drove him forward appears to have faded. The contrast with Alonso could not be more stark. At an age when most drivers are long retired, Alonso continues to operate with relentless intensity. Every lap, every data trace, every opportunity is treated as critical. That relentless approach exposes Stroll's more passive style, making the gap feel psychological as much as technical. Heading into 2026, Aston Martin will demand a level of precision, adaptability, and intensity from its drivers that goes far beyond anything required in recent seasons. The new regulations are not a simple evolution of the current cars, but a fundamental reset of how performance is generated, managed, and extracted. Lighter chassis, active aerodynamics, and radically different power units will place an unprecedented cognitive and technical burden on the driver, making adaptability a defining skill rather than a bonus. The power unit regulations alone change the role of the driver dramatically, with a far greater emphasis on electrical deployment and energy recovery. Drivers will no longer simply follow instructions, but actively manage complex systems while racing wheel-to-heel. Communication with engineers will need to be constant, precise, and proactive. Any hesitation, confusion, or lack of engagement will immediately translate into lap time loss, strategic errors, and compromised race execution. In this environment, there is nowhere to hide. Honda's return as a full works partner only amplifies that pressure. Manufacturers do not invest hundreds of millions to tolerate inconsistency or underperformance. They expect clear feedback, detailed technical input, and absolute accountability from the cockpit. Drivers become an extension of the development process, not just end users of the car. Those who cannot articulate problems clearly or adapt their driving to evolving concepts quickly risk becoming liabilities rather than assets. Adrian Newey's presence elevates these expectations even further. His designs are famously aggressive, concept-driven, and uncompromising. They reward commitment, confidence, and trust in the car's behavior, but they also punish hesitation brutally. Drivers who second, guess the concept, or lack belief in high-speed commitment tend to struggle. Newly built cars demand bravery, precision, and total alignment between driver and machine. This combination places Lance Stroll in an extremely uncomfortable position. For the first time in his Formula One career, his future may be judged almost entirely on objective performance metrics rather than long-term patience or internal loyalty. Aston Martin's ambitions leave little room for sentimentality as they enter what they believe is their best chance to establish themselves as genuine front-runners. The reputational stakes for the team are also enormous. Aston Martin are no longer content with being labeled a promising project with new Honda and massive investment in facilities. They want to be taken seriously as a championship contender, continuing with a driver widely perceived as underperforming undermines that message. Rivals will identify the weakness instantly. Sponsors will question competitive credibility, and internal morale can suffer when one side of the garage consistently underdelivers. For years, explanations around Stroll's results have followed a familiar pattern. Injuries, unlucky incidents, strategy calls, or car balance issues are often cited. While those factors do exist in Formula One, they lose persuasive power when repeated season after season. Some point, the narrative inevitably shifts from circumstance to capability, and with 2026 approaching, that shift is becoming increasingly visible. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of the current situation is not that Stroll lacks talent, but that there is little evidence of sustained progression. In modern Formula One, drivers are expected to evolve constantly, refining racecraft, improving tire management, adapting to new systems, and responding aggressively to pressure. While others continue to grow, Stroll's performance curve appears largely flat, and stagnation at this level is often more dangerous than outright failure. There is still a window for response, but it is narrowing quickly. A strong start to the new season, greater assertiveness in wheel-to-heel combat, and visible engagement in extracting marginal gains could alter perceptions. However, the margin for error is shrinking dramatically. With expectations at an all-time high, even small deficits will be magnified under the spotlight of a regulation reset. Internally, Aston Martin's decision-making framework is also evolving, with Newey shaping the technical philosophy and Honda influencing power unit direction. Performance logic will increasingly override legacy arrangements. Decisions will be driven by a feedback quality and competitive contribution rather than history or personal connections. That shift could force difficult conversations that were previously avoided. What once insulated Stroll may no longer carry the same weight. Ownership alone does not win championships, and Formula One history is filled with examples where internal loyalty eventually yielded to competitive necessity. Teams that aspire to titles cannot afford structural weaknesses, especially when entering a new era where early momentum may define years of success or struggle. Evidence emerging ahead of 2026 suggests Aston Martin are approaching a decisive crossroads. The question inside the team is no longer whether they can afford to wait for Stroll to elevate his performance, but whether they can afford the consequences if he does not. In a sport governed by relentless comparison, opportunity cost matters as much as outright results. If Stroll cannot significantly raise his level in the face of rising expectations, his position will become increasingly difficult to justify. Regardless of past patience in a team built around ambition, innovation, and elite execution, complacency is not merely a weakness. It is a threat to the entire project. This is why Lance Stroll now finds himself in serious trouble, not because of a single bad season or one critical opinion, but because the environment around him is transforming rapidly. As Formula One prepares to reset in 2026, only those who adapt, commit, and evolve will thrive, and those who do not risk being left behind by a sport that never waits. As Formula One edges closer to the 2026 reset, the spotlight around Aston Martin is only going to intensify. Every decision the team makes from now on will be judged through the lens of that new era, and every weakness will be magnified once the competitive order resets. For Lance Stroll, this means there will be no hiding behind long-term projects or transitional seasons. The next phase of Formula One will be unforgiving, and drivers who fail to immediately connect with the new machinery and philosophy will be exposed faster than ever before. What makes this moment so critical is that Aston Martin are no longer building quietly in the background, with Newey shaping the technical direction and Honda anchoring the power unit program. The team is openly signaling that 2026 is not about experimentation but execution. In that environment, patience becomes a luxury, not a strategy. If performance, feedback, and commitment are not instantly aligned with the ambition of the project, difficult decisions will become inevitable, regardless of past loyalty or personal ties. The question then is no longer whether Lance Stroll has talent, clears throat, but whether he can adapt to an environment that demands urgency, clarity, and relentless progression. Formula One does not wait for comfort or potential to mature at its own pace. As the sport prepares to enter its most demanding era in decades, only those who rise with it will remain at the center of the project. And for Aston Martin, 2026 may be the moment when ambition finally forces reality to make the final call.